The talk show host believed he held the upper hand until Pam Bondi turned the conversation around and left him struggling for a response. The studio lights felt oppressive, brighter and hotter than she had anticipated. Pam Bondi had appeared on television numerous times, debated significant cases, and faced countless reporters. However, this time felt unusual. A tension lingered in the atmosphere, an unspoken edge that set the tone before a single word was exchanged. She adjusted her blazer, maintaining a composed posture as she faced Graham Layton, the host of the exchange. Graham was known for his polished appearance and his reputation for testing his guests' limits. His hallmark was relentless questioning, an unwillingness to relent, and a knack for transforming interviews into public interrogations. Pam's invitation was framed as a conversation about justice, the law, and her tenure as Florida's Attorney General. Yet, as soon as she stepped onto the set, it became evident that there was another agenda. The energy in the room felt distant, almost hostile, anticipatory, as though the audience expected a confrontation. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the audience, a collection of faces illuminated faintly under dimmed house lights. Some leaned forward with curiosity, while others sat rigid, arms crossed, skepticism etched onto their features. The producer's countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The red recording light on the camera blinked to life. Graham leaned forward, a practiced smile stretching across his face, his lips tight and his expression devoid of warmth. "Pam, welcome to the exchange." Pam offered a polite nod, replying, "Thank you for inviting me." Graham's fingers drummed softly against the desk as he spoke, his tone smooth but laced with an underlying sharpness. "You've been surrounded by controversy for a long time. Your years as Attorney General, your political positions. Some argue your decisions have caused more harm than good. Would you consider that a fair assessment?" The opening question came sharp and direct, without preamble or build-up. Pam was no stranger to this tactic, yet there was a distinct aggressiveness to Graham's tone, signaling his intent for conflict rather than dialogue. Pam could sense that the audience recognized his approach as well. Remaining calm, her expression betraying nothing, she replied evenly, "I'd say that's a simplistic view of a complex record. But if you'd prefer to discuss specifics, I'm ready." Graham's lips curled into a small, tight smirk as he tilted his head slightly. "Oh, we'll get to specifics soon enough." Turning to face the camera, his voice carried an air of theatricality. "But let's begin with something straightforward. Many people, especially those impacted by your policies, believe you're disconnected from the lives of everyday Americans. That you've prioritized personal political interests over the greater good. Do you ever consider the consequences of your decisions for those on the receiving end?" The question wasn't genuine, it was bait. Pam recognized the tactic immediately and refused to fall for it. She clasped her hands together neatly on the desk, responding in a measured tone. "Every decision I've made has been guided by a commitment to uphold the law and protect the public. That doesn't mean every choice was popular, but leadership isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult." Graham chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's a convenient answer. But let's be honest, Pam." Leaning forward slightly, his voice took on a sharper edge. "Some people would say you've looked the other way when justice was inconvenient for you." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. The audience was silent, captivated by the escalating tension. Pam stayed composed, her pulse steady, familiar with Graham's tactic: provoke an emotional response, unsettle the guest, and make them defensive. She wasn't about to give him what he wanted. Taking a deliberate breath, she locked eyes with him. "Graham, it seems you're intent on making this personal. I'd appreciate the chance to actually respond to your questions rather than being subjected to baseless insinuations." The audience murmured softly. Graham's expression flickered, briefly, but he pressed on, ready to escalate further. They were watching a host who had just been called out. He shifted slightly but quickly recovered. "I'm saying that when people are desperate," Pam began, "they do desperate things. And when leaders refuse to engage with them, they feel abandoned." Pam didn't break eye contact. "Desperation doesn't justify violence," Graham retorted. "Would you say the same if that had been someone else in my position? If it had been a journalist or a politician you agree with? Or do different rules apply depending on the target? More murmurs rippled through the room. Graham exhaled sharply through his nose, visibly irritated. So you're playing the victim, Pam? Pam leaned back slightly. I don't have to. The footage speaks for itself. But if you'd like to have a conversation about the real issues instead of twisting events for drama, I'm happy to. A beat of silence passed. Graham shifted, flipping a page in his notes. But the energy in the room had changed. Pam wasn't just pushing back, she was taking control. Graham, however, wasn't about to let that stand. And so, he made his second mistake. He inhaled sharply, glancing down at his notes as if recalibrating. The cracks in his confidence were subtle, but they were there. He wasn't used to losing control of an interview. Pam, on the other hand, was steady, watching, waiting, and ready. But Graham wasn't giving up. If a personal attack hadn't shaken her, he'd go for something bigger. He set his papers down, laced his fingers together, and fixed Pam with a look that was almost pitying. All right, let's be honest here, Pam. You have a history of defending people and policies that a lot of Americans, frankly, the majority, find problematic. If you weren't in politics, if you didn't have power, do you really think you'd be standing here today? Or would you just be another person left behind by the very system you upheld? It was a clever pivot, designed to make her look out of touch, privileged, detached from the struggles of everyday Americans. Pam saw right through it. She tilted her head slightly. That's an interesting argument, Graham. You're saying that because I worked in the system, I somehow don't understand it. He smirked, sensing an opening. I'm saying you benefited from it. Pam leaned forward. You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past, so let me ask you something. What's your definition of justice? Graham's smile faltered. Excuse me? She gestured toward him. You sit here implying corruption, implying favoritism, implying that I got where I am because of privilege. So tell me, how do you define justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest? Who makes the most accusations? Or is it about facts? Graham's lips parted slightly, as if searching for a response. Pam didn't give him a chance. Because, Graham, if you're so confident that the system is broken, I'd love to hear your solution. You've had plenty of time to criticize me, but what exactly would you do differently? Silenced, a slow murmur rippled through the audience. Graham's fingers curled slightly against the desk. That's not my job, Pam. She nodded. Exactly. Your job is to stir controversy, to frame things a certain way, to make people think there's always a scandal, always a conspiracy. But let's get real, you don't actually care about justice. You care about making a spectacle. The audience's reaction was immediate, a few gasps, some murmured approval. Graham blinked, his composure slipping for the first time. Pam sat back. So, if we're done playing games, I'd love to actually talk about the issues. But if you just want sound bites, let me know. I'd hate to waste your time. The tension in the studio was suffocating. For the first time since the interview started, Graham looked caught, like he hadn't planned for this moment, like he didn't expect her to flip the script so effectively. He glanced at the camera, then back at Pam, exhaling through his nose. All right, he said, his voice noticeably tighter. Let's talk about the issues. But he wasn't in control anymore, and the audience knew it. Graham's fingers drummed lightly against the desk, a sign he was recalibrating. This wasn't going how he had planned. He was supposed to be the one controlling the tempo, steering the conversation, keeping his guest on the defensive. But somehow, Pam had turned the tide. Forcing a smile, though it was noticeably tighter than before, he said, All right, Pam. You want to talk about facts? Let's talk about facts. Pam nodded, waiting. Graham flipped through his notes again, though the gesture felt more like a stall tactic than a necessary step. You've been in the legal world for years. Prosecutor, attorney general, consultant. A lot of power, a lot of influence. Yet somehow, every time controversy arises, you manage to come out clean. Some people might find that suspicious. Pam raised an eyebrow. Are you accusing me of something? Graham spread his hands. I'm saying the average person doesn't have that luxury. When they get tangled up in the legal system, they don't walk away unscathed. Pam's expression didn't waver. The law isn't about luxury, Graham. It's about how well you understand it and how you navigate it. That applies to everyone, including me. Graham smirked again, but it was weaker this time. That's easy to say when you have the resources to fight back. Pam exhaled slowly. You're right. Not everyone has the same resources. But that's why understanding the law matters. That's why due process exists. That's why cases can't be tried based on public outrage or headlines. Graham opened his mouth, but Pam wasn't finished. In fact, that's exactly what we're doing right now, isn't it? You're not interested in facts. You're interested in framing me as some kind of privileged elite who dodges accountability. But you have no proof, no case, just vague accusations meant to stir the pot. The audience murmured again. The shift was undeniable. Now Graham's jaw clenched slightly, just for a fraction of a second. He was losing them. He could feel it. Pam tilted her head slightly. So tell me, Graham, what do you actually want from this conversation? Do you want to discuss real issues, or are we just here to entertain the people at home with a one-sided spectacle? Graham inhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. I think the people at home want transparency, he said. Pam nodded. Great. Then let's be transparent. Let's talk about why you keep interrupting me, why you frame things a certain way, why instead of discussing policy, you prefer to throw out accusations without evidence. More murmurs. Some audience members actually nodded. Pam continued, because, Graham, if your goal was to have a real discussion, you wouldn't be doing this. Graham forced a laugh. I'm just asking tough questions, Pam. She gave him a knowing smile. No, you're trying to make a headline. Silence. Graham glanced toward the producer as if looking for an out, but there wasn't one. The room was no longer hanging on his words, it was hanging on hers. And then, from the back of the audience, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, a single person. But then another joined in. And another. The applause grew, rippling across the room. It wasn't an explosive standing ovation, but it didn't have to be. Because in that moment, it was clear who had won. Graham swallowed, straightening his papers again, but it was just to keep his hands busy. The interview wasn't over yet, but it might as well have been. Pam Bondi had just turned the tables, and everyone in the room knew it. Graham cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile as the applause finally died down. His grip on the conversation had slipped through his fingers, and now there was no getting it back. Pam sat still, composed. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smirking. She had made her point, and the audience had seen it for themselves. Graham tried to salvage what was left. Well, Pam, it seems you've certainly made an impression here today. She met his gaze. I tend to do that. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he covered it quickly. He knew he had to wrap things up without making it obvious that he had lost control. Well, he said, shifting his papers as if the interview had gone exactly as he planned, I think that's about all the time we have. I appreciate you coming on and giving your perspective. Pam nodded. I appreciate the opportunity. Next time, maybe we can have an actual discussion instead of a performance. The audience chuckled. Graham gave a strained smile but didn't respond. He turned to the camera, his voice slightly tighter than before. That was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. We'll be right back after this. The moment the red recording light switched off, Graham pushed back his chair and stood, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The control room buzzed in his earpiece, but he ignored it. Pam stood as well, smoothing out her blazer. She turned to Graham, her tone polite but firm. If you ever decide you actually want a real conversation, let me know. He let out a quiet scoff. I ask the questions people want answered. Pam gave a small smile. No, you ask the questions that get clicks. And with that, she turned and walked off set. The second she stepped into the hallway, she was met with a flood of messages on her phone. Notifications blew up, Twitter, Facebook, news alerts. She tapped on a trending topic, #PamBondiUnfiltered. Clips of the interview had already hit social media. People were dissecting every moment. Her pushback, Graham's struggle to recover, the audience's shift in energy. Some called it a takedown. Others called it a rare moment when a guest refused to be steamrolled by a hostile interviewer. She scrolled past a few tweets. "I don't care what you think of Pam Bondi. This is how you handle a setup." Graham thought he had the upper hand until Pam Bondi flipped the script. That was brutal. This interview is a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. Watch and learn. There were critics too, of course, people twisting her words, trying to frame her as evasive or defensive. But the narrative was clear. She hadn't just survived the interview, she had owned it. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath. This was politics. This was media. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that no matter how hard someone tries to control the conversation, the truth always finds its way through. Moments like these remind us why staying composed under pressure matters. When faced with hostility, it's easy to get defensive, easy to lose your temper. But strength isn't just about fighting back, it's about knowing how to fight back. Pam Bondi didn't win that interview by yelling or getting angry. She won by staying sharp, refusing to be baited, and making sure the audience saw exactly what was happening. It's a lesson for anyone watching. Stay calm. Stay focused. And when the world tries to put words in your mouth, make sure you're the one controlling the narrative. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth stories and analysis. And tell us, have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground? Let us know in the comments.